slightly different from editing. And I will share with you what are the differences tonight. And then besides, we have to share about some techniques or some skills on translation. So what are the basic differences between Chinese and English that makes us so difficult in our translation? So I will share about that. And I will, there will be a class assignment today and also a home assignment today. I try not to make it too difficult and not too many for you, so that is like just to test your ability on how to identify the errors and to do the review and revision. So to start with, let's share about some of the definitions from some scholars. Eugene Nida is a very famous scholar on, he's a linguist, and this is the definition from him. What is translation? He said, translation consists in reproducing in the receptor language the closest natural equivalent of the source language message. First, in the terms of meaning, and secondly, in terms of style. So basically, translation, we as a translators are doing something to reproduce the language. But there is something that you have to pay attention is to have, when you do the reproducing process, it has to be the closest and natural equivalent of the source language message. So when it comes to close and natural equivalent, it has to be in terms of the meaning and also style. So not only, sometimes people do a very good translation in terms of meaning, but they lose the style. So it's not the complete equivalent. Another scholar, Peter Newmark, said that translating is a craft consisting in attempt to replace a written message and a statement in one language by the same message and or statement in another language. Each exercise involves some kind of loss of meaning due to a number of factors. So Peter said that when we do the translation, we are replacing a written message by another language, or by another language. But he is very honest, because he said that each exercise sometimes will involve the loss of meaning. Because English, especially, we are talking about English and Chinese, we're not talking about English to French, because some language, they have close roots. Like they have the Latin roots, then sometimes the loss of meaning will not be so significant. But for Chinese and English, we'll talk more about why there's a huge difference that results in loss of meaning. So especially for interpretation, when we talk about interpretation and translation, translation has the ability to retain a larger percentage of the original meaning. Whereas interpretation, very often we can only, the best interpreter, I would say, that can retain only 80 to 90% of the original content or meaning. First, because of the time. Even though you understand everything, the language, sometimes they only allow you to have the equivalent, the same time for you to reproduce the same message. So the time is a constraint. Secondly is the memory. The interpreter, we are human, sometimes we don't have enough memory, especially for a short-term memory. It's difficult for us to reproduce everything exactly as the source message. But for translation, it is easier, right? So you have time to do the research. You can do the draft and then polish it and then revise it, review it, and then in order to make a final product. So for translation, still, we realize when you read others' translation, you will realize that sometimes there's a loss of meaning. But the extent is not as significant or is not as serious as the interpretation. So there are some basic differences between translation and interpretation in terms of the loss of meaning. Okay, so as a translator, what are the fundamental requirements for translations? There are some scholars, some of them from China, some of them from other parts of the world, because they are all linguists, and then they have different opinions on the fundamental requirements for translations. So J.B. Phillips said that the test of a real translation is that it should not read the translation at all. So if you want to become a good or competent translator, if the people who read your translation, they don't realize that it's a translation at all, then you are very successful. And so how can we evaluate whether it's a good translation or not is by the product. So assuming that your translation is read by someone who's unilingual, that means that person can only understand Chinese or can only understand English, and then when that person reads your translation, they thought that it was something that is an original writing by someone, then you are very successful because they can't tell whether it's a translation or not. Then it is a very good translation. Another scholar, a famous scholar from China, Lam Yutong, he said that the qualities is 忠信、忠實、通順、美, or we always say that it's these are three very basic qualities of a good translation, 順雅達. But how to achieve that? So you will learn them, or you will practice them as you do more and more translation. Sun is faithfulness, whether it's a faithful translation of the original, is whether it's an elegant presentation, or whether it's a formal or informal translation, that is the accuracy. So these three basic requirements are very important. And then when you do your translation, or if you are the reviewer, we are going to do the group project, right? So if you're the reviewer, make sure that you use these three qualities as the yardsticks to measure or to assess whether the translator, the editor had done a good job or not. And other scholar, he said that faithfulness, expressiveness, and gracefulness were considered the golden rule in the field of translation. So these three. And then Cheng this person said that 不失原意，語文流暢 is the golden rules for translations. Another famous linguist or translator, Alexander Fraser Taylor, he said that translation should give a complete transcript of the ideas of the original work. So when you do the translation, make sure that you have to reproduce a complete transcript of the ideas. So the ideas should be kept in your translation. And you should not distort the original meaning or ideas or the message of the author. And secondly, the style and manner of writing should be of the same character with that of the original. So the character, that means the style, the tone, and the manner of writing should be kept in the same. Say, for example, they use some abbreviation. Say, for example, they use UNH, say, for example, do you know what is that? UNHCR. This is a short form. So the long form is United Nations High Commissioner of Refugee. Okay. So in English, we have this as a short form. So when you do the translation, probably the first time you mention the long form, and then the second time you just use the acronym. We call it acronym. So Chinese, sometimes we have also the acronym. So you have to follow the original. If the first time they use the long term, and the second time use the acronym, then in your translation you have to do the same thing. Chinese, we have also a lot of acronyms, right? Name of the agencies, we have a lot of acronyms. So this is one of the examples that you have to follow. So never say that, oh, I understand what is UNHCR, so every time you use this one and forget the long form. So as a golden rule, the first mention of the name, we always use the long form, or what you can do is bracket it and then make it an acronym, HCR. And then for the second time, or you say that hereinafter, we use this word, something like that. So next time you just repeat the acronym. So you have to follow the original style and manner of the writing of the source language, source document. And then thirdly, the translation should have all the case of the original composition. So to become a successful translator, you have to make sure that all the information in the original document has to be presented in the translation. Don't miss out anything unless it's really, you find it very redundant, or there's a need to delete or remove or replace. Otherwise, try to keep everything intact. Any questions so far?
So the case, so is it continental or unconditional?
Which one?
All the case?
All the case of original combination, what's the meaning?
All the case that all the information or all the reasons or the significant or the materials of the original composition.
No, I mean, do I need to put an S behind that?
Oh, I just quoted from him, so I don't know why he does this. It is not. He didn't include the S there. Again, from Eugene Neider, he said that the fundamental requirements for translation is you have to be true to the original, it has to be vivid, it has to be smooth and natural, and it has to have the equivalence of response. So basically, each scholar or linguist, they have similar point of view, but is the accent is you have to be accurate, faithful, true, and smooth, graceful, equivalent. But it is easier said than done, right? Sometimes we all know the requirements, but sometimes it's really hard to follow. And then in the following sections, we're going to talk about the pitfalls, some common pitfalls in translations, because we don't realize there's a pitfall unless we will point it out to you later on. So where are the pitfalls? First of all, it will appear in the original document. The original document, then sometimes the author does not expect it to be translated, right? So they just write it freely, and then they don't care about how it will be translated. So the original document may have different qualities that make it difficult for the translators. So that's why we will learn about the different skills in translating different kinds of documents. We'll talk about how to translate medical documents, how to translate legal documents, how to translate some financial documents. Each kind of documents has its qualities that make it, that we should pay attention to as some specialities in those kind of documents. And those are the pitfalls that you have to be mindful of. And secondly is the translator. The translator, because we all come from different backgrounds. So some, like when we are working in Vancouver, we have people, Chinese people coming from China, mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. At least 3 regions. At least there are 3 different kinds of regions. So our background, our knowledge, our educational background, our cultural backgrounds have given us some differences. So when we do the translation, we assume we will bring all our knowledge or our experience into the paper. And sometimes that could become a pitfall because you don't understand others' Chinese. So you assume that all your translation is well understood by all Chinese, which actually is not the case. Very often you have to listen to others or to ask whether it's understood by other groups of Chinese. So the translators could be, the backgrounds of the translator could be a pitfall for you to, that cause you some mistakes in your translations. We'll share about the differences, the regional differences in, especially from these 3 regions, so that we will try to avoid to have those kinds of pitfalls. And then the customer's expectations, because some customers have different expectations. Some customers are so, they know nothing about what the translation process, they know nothing about the readers. So they assume that, okay, I give you this piece of document and then you return it to me within 3 business days and I will pay you for whatever charge you charge. So they don't have any information about the reader's needs. So they give, in this case, the customer will give you the impression that they are very easy to deal with. So you don't ask many questions, and then you just start your translation with whatever you think is correct. But sometimes it ends up, you have spent a lot of time doing that work, but it's useless. Say, for example, you don't ask the question whether this translation is to be read by people from mainland China, or by Taiwanese, or by Hong Kong people. And then you assume that because you come from mainland China, you did the translation in simplified Chinese, and then it ended up is to be read by people from Taiwan or from Hong Kong. And then it's a complete useless or not very helpful, if not useless, right? So the customer's expectations can become a pitfall for us to do the translation. So in order to avoid those pitfalls, I would recommend you to check with the customers. There are some basic questions you should ask. Say, for example, the language. You should ask whether it's simplified Chinese or traditional Chinese. It's very, very important. Or if they have no idea, they just give the answer Mandarin, or they just say that Chinese. And then you have to explain to them about the regional differences in these 2 languages. And try to press the customer to give you the answer. Because in this case, you are not accountable for anything, the end result, because you have asked the questions and then you have done your translation to meet the expectations of the customers. Without asking those questions, you may fall into the pitfalls of doing something which is not the customer's need, which does not meet their needs. Cultural and linguistic differences between the source language and target language. So we'll talk about that later on. Or actually I can share with you some of those differences. Actually there's so many differences, but I would just point out the 3S. The major cultural differences, I would say the 3S. first S is substitution. Second, subject. Third, subordination. Okay, substitution. English, for when you read English, you will easily find that the English people or the English writing does not have a lot of repetitions, except in terms of the law, the legal writings. Otherwise, for some general English writings, you won't find a lot of repetitions. But for Chinese, we always have a lot of repetitions. I can give you an example of this. Okay, so this is one sentence in Chinese. Okay, so this is in Chinese, okay? So can you all understand simplified Chinese or traditional Chinese? Because my handwritings will be a combination of both. I hope you understand, okay. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Okay, so this is in Chinese. And I'm going to write the English translation. It's just an example. We're not going to judge on the quality of translation at this point, but we will see the style of writing of English and Chinese so that you know that there's something we need to be mindful of when we do the translation. So, I will say it in Cantonese and then in Mandarin later. 就我們國家來說，就首先是要擺脱貧窮，要擺脱貧窮，要找出一條比較快的發展道路。就我們國家來說，首先是要擺脱是嗎？貧窮，要擺脱貧窮，要找出一條比較快的發展道路。
So for the Chinese version, we can know the speaker is Chinese because we say our country, but for English version.
Okay, so I just pointed to you, we are not judging, we're not commenting on the translation first. I just want to show you the characteristics of Chinese, the differences between Chinese and English. On that three S. One is the subject, subordination, and also substitution. So we're talking about substitution at this point. So don't comment on the translation at this point. I just want to show the characteristics because some Chinese people, they don't mind about repetition. So they thought it as a stress. They repeat this sentence again, right? So to them it's a stress. But when we do the translation, very often we don't repeat the same sentence. We eliminate that by using this word. So because of course you can still repeat that one, but it looks very clumsy when it comes to translation, right? So why do we not repeat that one? And then when you read it, you find it's okay, it's still understood. You don't find it too redundant because you thought it is an emphasis, right? But in English, people won't do it the same way. They won't repeat evidence. They don't to throw off property. It's quite weird and quite rare. So very often they will just shorten it to become like this. So the main difference between Chinese and English itself is the substitution. In English, we always use this way. So similarly, when you do your translation, if this is the source language, so we're not commenting on whether it's a good translation or not. So assuming this is someone who's written this, a person wrote this in English, when you translate it, you can repeat the same sentence. But on the contrary, when you translate from English from Chinese to English, try to avoid that because of this rule, substitution. In English, they prefer to use substitution. Okay? There are other examples, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. I just give you one example to elaborate these three S. Okay, the second one is the subject. And we've always said that English has a very strong element in terms of grammatical rules. But in Chinese, people, when I talk to a lot of English speakers, they find it very difficult to learn Chinese because they said that Chinese is a lack of grammatical rules, especially when it comes to subject, object, subject clause, object clause. It is hard for the non-Chinese speakers to understand how Chinese can make up a sentence, right? So here is some, because the subject is lacking, very often the subject is lacking. Or the object, the relationship between subject and object. Okay. So Chinese. again, the translation may not be a perfect one, so we're not commenting on the translation at this point, but just look at the characteristics. Okay. Chinese 中國水域草原山地資源豐富，開發潛力巨大。When Chinese is, we just mentioned the first time, and then there's a, like you can has a lot of modifier or a lot of clauses, phrases following that without mentioning the subject again. And then for English, sometimes it's hard for them. So what they will, this is a translation, but I don't think it's a perfect one, but nevertheless, let's not comment on the translation at this point. You see, Chinese has rich water, grassland, and sloping land resources. So they need to add some linking words like which have great potential for exploitation. So they cannot like comma, 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 like the Chinese way of saying that. So there's a basic difference between Chinese and English is the subject, object, and then actually, and English has a lot of these linking words that to make the sentence more readable. Or actually, it's the characteristics of English way of writing or expressing things. Again, this is only one example. Well, I just want to point out to you, when you do the role as a translator, editor, or reviewer, make sure you bear these things in mind, so that you will find the differences between Chinese and English. When you rewrite it, when you review it or revise it, you know which are the pitfalls that you have to pay attention to. And then last S is subordination. English has lots of layers. But Chinese, the layers is not so obvious, or it's very, sometimes it's very abstract. This is spoken by a Chinese leader. Okay, so in Chinese, we will 中國的基本路線要維持100年動搖不。It's written, is spoken by one of the Chinese leaders. So you have to be very firm, right? And whereas in English, when it's translated, So this is the clause follow the main clause. And this is we would just say that it's an idiomatic way of saying things. But the subordination is in English we can see the subordination, but whereas in Chinese it's not a subordination. Right? So there's a relationship, between the first sentence, the first clause and the second clause, and then, but for this one, it's not a subordination. So that is the main difference between Chinese and English. And then when we do the translation, it is hard for you to, if you follow, say for example, this is an English original translation, and if you follow this English style of writing, it will look very much like a translation. It doesn't look like Chinese at all. Whereas these two this is the original translation, it has a very unique Chinese way of writing. And then this is also a very unique way of English writing. So when you do the translation, you have to bear in mind the characteristics, the structural characteristics, the grammatical characteristics of Chinese and English before you can do a good translation. We'll talk more about the essential differences between Chinese and English later on, but because we are talking about the cultural and linguistic